Good evening, everybody. It is me, Nick, Pennsylvania, here again, as always, with my friend Brendan Bond. And before I say anything else, I just want to say we had our last week. We had our conversation. I'm kind of surprised there hasn't been people calling us out about that. We kind of anticipated more. So, as always, we want to encourage you to write to us. I did see something, but it was in Portuguese, which I do not understand Portuguese at all. But I'm very excited because we have a good friend of ours, Heidi, here with us, and it is the Halloween season. And we wanted to kind of talk about a few things, that being some of these Halloween traditions. So many of them come from the Celtic tradition, jack-o'-lantern being probably the most visible, at least to me. And for those of you not aware, the original jack-o'-lanterns, do you know what they were carved from? Turnips. Turnips. Mighty fine detail work on your turnip lantern there. So, anyhow, as Bond said, when we were talking a little bit beforehand, so much of Celtic mythology reminds him of American folklore because of just, there's all these little things. So I'm really curious, and Heidi knows a lot of these Celtic traditions around Halloween, or what becomes known as Halloween over here. I'm just going to hand it over to Brendan. This is not an area where I have a ton of knowledge, so I'm just kind of here to take notes today and ask some questions along the way. So, Brendan, all yours.
Thank you, Nick. Yeah, really excited to be talking with you tonight, Heidi. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you for having me. No one is interested in listening to me talk about it. You are.
Well, it's one of those things where we talk a lot about how spooky a lot of our friends are, and you come up in that conversation quite often. And whenever me and Nick were talking about doing something Celtic related tonight, you seem like a natural choice to bring in for that.
I will put it all in one word. I remember one time when I came out to visit, we were talking books, which is a standard thing, but I had gotten up early the next morning. I started reading a book. And Brendan, you ever read the Sand County Almanac? Not Sand County Almanac, I'm sorry. Spoon River Anthology, where it's essentially a bunch of epitaphs. There was a Celtic book of a similar vein where it's a bunch of deceased people talking smack on the living and everything. That was all I needed.
I'm not familiar, but that sounds fantastic. Yeah.
I took a photo of the book. I still haven't gotten a copy yet, but it's an interesting read.
Right. But yeah, like you were saying earlier, Nick, like a lot of the Celtic stuff, when I was younger, I was just like, oh, this stuff reminds me of other American things that I've, heard, or I wonder where those things come from. And being of Irish descent, started looking into a lot of that stuff, even when I was, relatively young. A lot of it just really fascinated me because I saw a lot of it in practice in my family's traditions, greater pop culture traditions, and a lot of the folklore that I was reading about just, Pennsylvania, and even the some of the powwow Dutch stuff from the eastern side of the state. A few years ago, I got a book literally just called Celtic Mythology and Folklore. That's something I've read through a ton. So we wanted to use that as kind of a jump-off point tonight to talk about some of the Celtic traditions and how they relate to Halloween. So Heidi, the first question I have for you is, how do you pronounce the Glenn Danzig band?
I'm sorry to say that I do not call it Sam Hain.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I begrudgingly call it Sam Hain, only because that's what I've known my whole life. It's only been literally in the last few, because even when I started looking up this stuff, you see it phonetically written out, and you're like, oh yeah, Sam Hain, cool. But as you just said, the holiday that it references, or holiday or festival that it references, is pronounced Samhain. When it comes to that holiday and everything, Heidi, can you tell us a little bit about what you know about Samhain?
Boy, there's a lot there. It just kind of depends on where you want to start. Like, if you want to start with more of a historical perspective, it's traditionally a day that was believed that the separation between the physical world and the spiritual world or the world of other creatures was a little bit thinner, and then that evolved into more 20th century beliefs where it was taken on by neo-paganists, and they do their thing with the wheel of the year, and it's Celtic New Year in their perspective, which you don't have to share. That's okay. They're entitled to their thing just like everybody is. So yeah, it just kind of depends on what direction you want to go with that. If you want to start with an old historic perspective or a more modern perspective.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Nick.
No, I've got just one quick question, and that is, why that whole thinning of the veil? Why now? Is there a celestial reason that I'm not aware of? Is it because of harvesting? I associate so much of people's religious practices as being tied directly to the earth or to the stars.
Darkness. It gets real dark real quick, and it's dark. That would be the obvious answer to me, is if I were a person without access to all of the modern knowledge and science that we have, and it got really, really dark, I'd be like, oh, it's scary. It's much, much, much more frightening. There might be more bad things or unexplainable things hiding in all that darkness.
Yeah, I would. My initial reaction is the same as yours, Heidi. I think that it has a lot to do with darkness, the fact that you're spending more time in the dark than in the light. So the balance is a little different. And the dark is obviously associated with the unknown, the other, danger, death, the other world, the underworld. So I don't think we always use the term thinning of a veil, but I think practically it's more along the lines of there's a higher likelihood of things coming through, not so much that a barrier has thinned, but the barrier maybe has shifted and the distance between you and the other is lessened.
I wonder, and it's something that I don't know, and maybe you guys know, or it's something to look into, the idea of the thinning of the veil. How much does that relate to the idea of thin places that come up, particularly in Irish folklore, places where it's easier to access otherworldly things? That language, is there a connection there, or is it just a happy coincidence?
Well, I think that kind of leads me down kind of two roads. I think that what you're getting to is a topic that comes up all the time on this and other paranormal podcasts, is the idea of liminality. And for some reason, the idea of transition has something to do with what we're talking about a lot here. And I know we haven't gotten to the whole idea of pixies or the fairies or any of the other words for them yet. That's often where they're found as well, in those liminal spaces, in those in-between spaces, in those transitions. And I think that also goes back to what you said, Nick, about the beliefs and traditions. We see that around harvest time, around solstices, equinoxes, anytime there's transitions happening. And with Samhain, see, I almost said Samhain, Samhain, you have a number of those transitionary periods all happening in a relatively short period of time. So if you have all those things stacking up, your likelihood of something coming through is probably a little bit higher. So yeah, I think you're absolutely onto something with that, Heidi. Now, since we started talking about that, I think especially when you talk about Halloween and everything, like the American tradition, the idea of dressing up and going in costume and playing tricks and everything, that's kind of a weird tradition if you don't look into where it came from at all. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. There's no other time throughout the year where we do things like that. I think most people know that Halloween has its roots in some of these like Samhain and similar similar holidays around the harvest time and around, fall, the equinox. But it's very different looking than a lot of our other holidays. When it comes to dressing up, was that something that you guys did a lot when you were younger?
Nick?
I'm just curious.
I was going to say, yeah, I dressed up a lot for Halloween as a kid, and I honestly, I dressed up a lot just as a kid, just in general. I remember going to a tour of an old house in Delaware, like a really early house in Delaware, and they had a gift shop, and they had this shirt that I thought was really cool. It was very Rob Roy. It's a bit off now, I think, but I remembered the fabric. I remember it didn't have buttons. It just had a tie thing, and just the sleeves came down, so it was like a tunic of sorts. I remember my mom, I'm like, Mom, I want this shirt. I need you to make this shirt. And I remember both my parents were a little confused, not because of the shirt thing, because I was like 8, but because I remember the texture of the fabric. I remember the name of the shirt. And I remember them saying, these aren't things most people notice. And I had some pride in that. But yeah, so I dressed up a lot as a kid. And I was that kid.
I like that.
Big deal at our house. I have this theory that it's kind of like you're either an Elvis man or a Beatles man. You're either a Halloween person or a Christmas person. And my mother, bless her heart, was a Christmas person through and through, and I am not. But my father is a Halloween person. And it was such a big deal. It was our thing, and we would start planning my costume in like August. And like I remember him taking me to when we still had independent costume stores. And because my dad is a gentleman of a certain age, he doesn't call them masks, he calls them false faces. And we would pick out, like one year he got me a full unicorn false face, and like him spray painting my like sneakers gold and like putting together these like crazy costumes. It was such a big thing.
I feel like I need to add false face to my vocabulary, because
that's fantastic.
Yeah, that's like that takes icebox out of my running of like things only people of a certain generation say.
Yeah, he says icebox too, and I've had to like change my vocabulary because people will make fun of me for saying icebox or calling a sleeping bag a bedroll because of my dad. So I have to.
I've heard bedroll before. I'll admit to that.
Bedrolls, I think. Yeah, I would agree.
That's what you take when you go bivouacking, of course.
Right. As one does.
Your story right there, Heidi, kind of illustrates, and yours, Nick, like how intertwined a lot of this tradition is with our memories and like our family and everything. Family plays a big part in these traditions, and like the little things we do, like dressing up around this time, we might put a lot of time and effort into the outcome of it, but we don't think so much about why we're doing it.
Yeah, and that's what I'm wanting to ask, because earlier on I was going to try to steer this conversation by asking what practices of this Glenn Danzig, Brian Baker, Lyle Preslar vehicle would modern people recognize? Solway, is that? Did I say that right? Solway?
Solway.
Because that's just because Solway is just hello in Latin.
Yeah.
But
Solway Magistra. I do remember that.
Thank you.
I remember Solway Magistra. Yeah.
Okay. The bottom line was I was going to ask what practices from this celebration or rite would modern people recognize. You've already talked about dressing up, but what was the historic reason for doing that? Was this like what we see in Switzerland, where they dress up and play obnoxious music to scare away bad things? What was the ceremonial or celebratory purpose of the dressing up?
Now, I've heard from different folklorists different answers to that question. Some will give you the similar answer that, oh, you would dress up like this and it would frighten away all the baddies. But I have also heard from other sources that if you were going to go about at night, if you were going to go from, your house to visit a relative, or you were going to go play cards or whatever, you would dress in these costumes so that you would blend in with the baddies, and then they wouldn't think that you were, a target.
Right. That's always been my understanding when reading a lot of the folklore, is that because again, night comes into this when you're out at night. Because a lot of Celtic stories, just like a lot of stories over here, involve going places at night by yourself is generally dangerous. And when you talk about the Fae and things of that nature, there's almost always nocturnal elements to that. And I agree. I've always heard, and I think what makes the most sense is you dress up, especially in, a lot of times in green, sometimes with a red hat, to go out at night to blend in, so you don't make yourself a target. You don't look like a normal Joe Schmo out there just walking down the lane. And when you get into the whole trick element of like trick or treating, I think a lot of American folklorists would say that sounds a whole lot like gifting. You give, gifts, offerings to insert paranormal being to curry favor or have them not bother you. So I've always kind of subscribed to that origin of dressing up and trick or treating.
Like I said, I was introduced to the idea of this actually through the Danzig band, post Misfits Danzig, and I remember that I might not have known of this until after listening to them as a kid, which is a silly thing, but it's also what got me into learning Latin when I was in high school. So there's that too. Doors open strangely.
Mm-hmm. Right,
listen, Heidi,
right.
Let me recite you a brief poem, if I may.
Oh, Lord,
maybe you've heard it before.
Yep.
Mica mica, pava stella, miraquinum sistambella, superterra in Kylo, albagema splendido. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. Sounds better this way. Anyhow, but what are some other? So I take it though from what you're saying is that this dressing, it was a functional thing. If the latter theory is to be believed, that it was to kind of hide yourself. So would this be something that was done through most of the autumn and winter months, or was this just there was a period around a certain festival that it was just believed that this would be the safest way? I don't know how long. It wasn't a singular night.
That's a really good question. I honestly don't know the answer to that. If it happened just during the equinox, or if it was during a period like between. Yeah, I don't know. Heidi, do you know the answer to that right off the top of your head?
Well, real quick, because my assumption is based on what the two of you have said, that hey, that it's getting darker a lot quicker. We got these nights of the long moon. It seems to me that I would, if I were operating in a world where that was the belief, that I would be seeing it like when we would skate on the pond up until spring, and there was a time where it was dangerous, but it got progressively more dangerous because the ice became slushier and thinner. So thinner.
All back to that notion of thinner. I can't speak to anything about any kind of ancient tradition because I'm simply ignorant. I haven't had the opportunity to read anything about that or go into that in any great detail. But from what I have listened to, as many of the recordings that I could get my hands on from the National Folklore Collection in Ireland. And they will speak a lot about late 19th century into the 20th century. And that was very specific to just Halloween.
Now, along kind of with that, though, Nick, just to kind of try to answer your question a little bit, I know, and Heidi, you might know some of these as well. I know that there year-round were deterrents that people would employ to keep the Fae or the other kind of like at bay. A lot of times that was carrying iron, or even if that was just like nails. You know, when people see a horseshoe above a door, that's what it's for. Carrying salt. Whenever I was little, I thought that everyone carried McDonald's salt packets in their pants when going to a funeral. You know, I just thought that's what we had. Those little salt packets, like two little tubes in the paper.
Well, sometimes funeral potatoes can be bland. So
well, of course,
prepare accordingly.
Episode name right there, funeral potatoes. But like, yeah, but I mean, some of them are a little more common or a little kind of weirder, like wearing clothes backwards, even singing and stuff like that when you're out to keep them away, because it makes you seem like less of a threat, less of a target.
Dump out liquid to warn them, because if you get them wet, they'll be very upset.
Right.
Which I've done, and I thought that was something everybody did, and it wasn't until I got to college I was like, oh.
Yeah. It's funny, whenever I was younger, and I still give my parents a hard time for this to this day, but this kind of goes back to the idea of offerings. I used to think that people in my family would leave out tea every day as like an offering. But as I got older, I realized they would just pour a cup of tea and then forget. But I don't know.
My daughter still does that. She just wasted so. Just this afternoon, my wife and I are sitting in the living room, and there's a tall glass of iced tea, and we were both waiting to ask each other, "Is that yours?" And she shot first, and I realized, no, that's Claire's from last night. That she had taken like 2 sips of it. It was a healthy offering to.
Well, again, if she was being quick about it, she would say, "Well, Father, that is just my offering to the house brownies to keep them helpful and not."
And I would be terrified. Terrified. I don't need none of this Darby McGill action up in my house.
All I can think about is Willow, and they're screaming, "I hate brownies."
That's where my mind went to.
But yeah, I mean, since we're talking about the Fae element, like I think what a lot of these practices revolve around fairies, the Fae, the other crowd, the other folk. There's a lot of names out there for them.
Well, and Faye's the one, and almost every single time we sit and have a conversation, you bring that up, and again, I still remain uninformed, so you should probably go down that rabbit.
So
I don't want to go down that rabbit.
So I feel like almost every culture has some form of this, right? Where there is unseen forces of the other side, whatever the other world is that's around us, that remains unseen, but just as much there. The Fae, or fairies, pixies, whatever you want to call them, in Ireland have a very rich tradition of trying to think how to even encompass it. Like there's a whole pantheon there that I don't really want to call it a folk tradition or religion or myth. It's kind of a little bit of all those things. You need an actual folklorist, I think, to parse out a lot of it. But it's basically the Celtic version of the other. It's a big question. Heidi, am I doing it any justice? Do you have a better way or more eloquent way of summing it up?
The way that I feel like contemporary Americans approach the concept of fairy is very different than the tradition of the good people. And the American idea is very much much closer to the idea of the brownie, the helpful shoemaker, and they look like Tinkerbell, and there's this like lovely Victorian English element of it. And I have COVID brain, so forgive me, I can't remember the photographer who baked.
The Coddington.
The Coddington fairies, and it was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle that was really associated with those. The photographers, I think, were just those two young girls that were involved with some paper cutout fairies. Yeah.
But I think the tradition that I have had exposure to or read about or have again listened to things from the National Archive, Folklore Archives, is very different than that idea of these helpful spirits. Under the right circumstances, the good people can do a good turn for you. If you do something for them, absolutely, and you do want to keep them on the correct side, but you do refer to them as the good people and not anything else because you don't want to make them mad.
Sounds a lot like the mafia.
It's very much, that's exactly how I would describe it. It's very much a supernatural mafia. And, there were things, people would actively do, you would leave a little bit of grain out at the end of the harvest because that doesn't belong to you. That's for the good people. Or, if there was a fairy tree in the middle of your field, well, yeah, you could pull that out and plow that land and plant it, but you don't want to incur the wrath of the good people. Or sometimes even modern politicians in Southern Ireland campaign to move the route of an entire highway so you don't destroy a fairy fort, because do you really want to take the risk?
Well, I have a question about that, because I know you've talked about fairy rings in the past, Brendan, and now I'm hearing about fairy trees and a fairy fort. How does one distinguish these things, and are they all related?
So a lot of times these things are places where they dwell. You hear about fairy rings a lot of times in reference to like when people see a ring of mushrooms or something like that. People say that's like where they've been dancing. What Heidi is referring to is often referred to as like a fairy fort. You hear a lot. Those are kind of like, I've always interpreted those as kind of like portals. It's an entrance to their realm. Whereas you hear a lot about trees too, specifically like hazel trees and I think like yew trees, certain types of hawthorns, is more of like a dwelling. Like I think that's where you get the aesthetic kind of trope of them living in like a tree trunk. It comes from those types of trees. Now I don't know if there's any. I guess I could look at my dictionary here or my encyclopedia. I'm going to see if there is a good definition of fairy fort in here.
Heidi, I know you've been over to Ireland. I know Brendan has been quite a few times. Have you been able to see anything like this? How frequently are these things? Like, are these known as like? I've talked about any community of reputable size is going to have a haunted house. Any community of reputable size with train tracks is going to have the supposed haunted crossing where the kids that were hit in the bus are going to try to push their car over the train tracks. Is it something like that where most any town will have a place where people, whether they believe it or not, say, well, that's the fairy fort or that's the fairy tree or something like that?
I think there was definitely a time where they were much more prolific. I think it was something that, you had a pub, you had a fairy fort. Eddie Lenahan, who happens to be one of my absolute favorite folklorists, has lamented the loss of many of these places. They are being developed. There's new housing estates being built. They're being knocked down for roads. The farming has fundamentally changed. It's become so mechanized. It's modernized now that, they are getting rid of, the fairy trees that are in the fields. And his concern is in losing these things, they're losing touch with a part of the culture. And that's part of what spurred him on to do what he does and recorded just countless hours of wonderful stories and, folk tales of just everyday older Irish people. So I would say that based on what Mr. Lenihan has said, and I hold him in great esteem, that they are not as prevalent as they once were, unfortunately. But it seems like at one time there were many places that had little hills and little entrances to the other.
It's what put this town on the map. I think about like driving through Western Ohio, and every town is a facsimile. You have to have three things. You get the Tasty Freeze, you get the hot dog stand, you get a post office, and boom, you're in. Water tower, too. Yeah.
Right.
Well, did you find yourself a definition there?
The book basically says any place favored by the good people. I think one of the things that always makes me think about those areas, as anyone who's been to especially rural parts of Ireland knows, there still are a lot of holy wells around, which is from a much later tradition, a Catholic tradition, but it's striking. Again, you could have a whole podcast on the overlap between old Celtic mythology and folklore and how it transitioned into Catholic. But you see a lot of times that the same places are revered, just with different, they use different words for it.
I seem to remember, and again, wrath, any place with wrath in it is a reference to a hill or one of these little forts. So that's very common.
Well, I have a question here then.
Yep.
So it's you've kind of talked about how a lot of these beliefs were tapered down to a thing that we do. We don't necessarily believe in it, but it's connecting us back to history and whatnot. Just a real quick question, because I feel like a lot of that sort of stuff happened with a lot of folklore and fairy tales of European and African and that whole Eurasian African area during really the spiritualist movement. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
That's my theory, but how far back does writing on this go? Like, is there like a historical text that people can point to and go, these traditions are much older than this. However, we have an old text, like say like the Egyptian Book of the Dead, or the Talmud or the Bible, or so much. Is there anything like that? I'm kind of curious. Go ahead, Heidi.
I believe it was Dahi O'Hogan who wrote in one of his books, who, again, fabulous folklorist, terribly disappointed I didn't have the courage to write him a letter before he passed, who put together something with the idea that first beings into Ireland, something.
The Tordadana? Is that how you pronounce it? It's one of the. Yeah, it's the.
They were the first being. They had the fight for who got to live above ground, who got to live below ground. They lost. They went below ground, and the good people are an extension, an offshoot, an evolution of these original inhabitants of Ireland. So that's the closest that I can point for you based on, again, my limited scope of knowledge. I am not a PhD in Celtic folklore, unfortunately. That's an origin story, a source. And
yeah, I'm looking it up right now to see when that was like compiled. Because I mean, you have a lot of the original folklore. And again, you'll hear people talk about the cycles of Celtic mythology, and a lot of that was originally documented in the fifth century, or what?
Yeah, because I don't know. I mean, you mentioned Catholicism, and that they would take some of these sites and essentially change the names, like the Holy Wells, I believe you called them.
Yeah,
and of course, being a kid in Louisiana, there's all the talk about how voodoo and Santeria and all these things are the combination of a lot of African beliefs combining with Catholicism, and kind of the two kind of commingle in order to get along in a way.
Mhm.
So I didn't know if a lot of these writings, I don't know how much writing, or if there was a writing system before the before the arrival of Catholicism. I honestly don't know. I really don't know, because you mentioned the Romans, and it was always my impression that they never had any sort of historic landing in Ireland itself. But of course, there's the Celtic people have moved about a lot since Roman times. I think of northern Spain, which the Romans definitely had a hold on, and I think of the UK, Hadrian's Wall, and going up into Scotland and whatnot.
Right. And I think that, like, as far as like the early writings and everything go, I believe there are, I mean, you hear people talk about I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Ogham writing, that I know dates back to, like, maybe 5th century AD. So, like, I mean, I'm sure later than that, you probably have the first real serious compilations of stuff that might have some of those folkloric elements built in, because you have to remember, back in these times, there weren't folklorists in the 1200s. There was just historians and people writing down these stories. And I think that's where you get a lot of the early stuff, is it just kind of slowly seeps in to the other writings, and you have, in a lot of cases, like with Ireland, you have the Catholic Church kind of co-opting a lot of the Celtic holidays. And again, that's not a new statement. That, Easter, Christmas, a lot of those things are amalgamations, and they are proxies for other older traditions. Doesn't make them any less valuable, but they're more of a compilation or an aggregate rather than a whole cloth.
So did the church ever take some of these characters, the good people, the leprechauns, the banshees and things, did they ever kind of bring them into that world? Or have those just always kind of existed? Did those become more of a folklore belief than a true spiritual belief? What are your thoughts on that?
Well,
and I don't know if you want to delve deeper into some of these characters.
I think that when you talk about the elements of these folklore traditions, it's almost counterproductive to reference them as like, well, did people think about these things as folklore? To them, it was just how the natural world worked around them. There wasn't a separation between why you carry iron on you and how to start a fire. It was the same alchemical elements, that were coming together to serve a purpose. And I really don't think it wasn't until later that people started putting some of those names on it. I'm sure the church made, just like it did in other places, and other churches have done the same things, made some conscious decisions about, like, okay, we're gonna brand this, as demonic or negative or whatever, and other things we're gonna say, oh no, this is cool, to keep people happy, But I don't know of any specific deities or demigods or whatever you want to call them that were co-opted or anything. Heidi, are you aware of any?
Not outside the context of a saint, but
right.
I kind of feel like less like the church co-opted the myths as much as the myths kind of co-opted the church, because there's so many of these folk tales that, started with, like, my cousin's brother's neighbor
right
was coming home from the card game, and the horse got to the crossroads and he wouldn't move and he didn't know what to do. It was his only horse. So the rider jumped off and ran to the nearest priest's house and brought the priest back. And once the priest got there, then the horse was able to move because the puka,
right,
was scared by the man of God, and the day was saved.
Right. I think they're so far intertwined. It really is hard to parse out. And I think that can be frustrating because I think from like a academic and scholastic standpoint, we want to like be able to put footnotes on these things to say where they came from and how to kind of organize them. I think you're right. I think that's exactly where a lot of this stuff comes from, and I think that's also why, going back to what I said when we were kind of starting, I see so many elements that remind me of things we have over here. And one of the things we talk about with folklore all the time over here is how practical a lot of it is, with like the whole don't go into the woods at night, don't follow lights into the woods, don't do whatever. We could talk about like that connection all night. But one of the things I wanted to bring up, because it's out of this book, that I want to know if you guys have ever heard of, that falls into this practical realm that I think reminds us of some American stuff. Have you guys ever heard of the term calamity meat?
That's a no over here.
That's a no. Yeah, that would be a great. It's a great name for a kind of sludgy garage rock band. If anyone out there is looking for a band name, Calamity Meat.
Or an insurance company.
Yeah. Yeah. No, but this is something I've had highlighted in this book for 15 years. Calamity meat is animals like farm animals, like cows, goats, sheep, that seem to have died for no good reason. They just drop dead out of nowhere. The Fae would be blamed for these. And because they had been touched, they wouldn't eat the animal. They would just put a iron nail in its hide and then bury it, because either the meat has been tainted by the other, or it's actually a dead fairy that has been swapped for the real cow. The real cow's over in the fairy realm now. And this is actually an old dead fairy that they're kind of repurposing, and you certainly don't want to eat that either. So you put the nail in it and you bury it in the ground. Now, at pretty much any given time in the history of Ireland, a cow was worth a lot of money. Even a single goat or a single sheep would be a lot. That's a lot of meat and money to waste on what some people might call a superstition or a chance. I've always thought of that as such a good practical, folkloric kind of thing, because the practical application is, hey, we don't know why that animal died. It might not be safe to eat. And there's tons of other folklore, both Celtic and over here, around farm animals. I mean, look at the books we have on like powwow magic. And
it was actually Heidi that bought me my copy of the Langfu Bogan Front, the long lost friend.
Yeah, and look how many things in there have to deal with witched cattle, which is just the same. It's just a proxy for Fae touched cattle, maybe. I don't know. But yeah, calamity meat. I wanted to bring it up and see what you guys thought about that.
I have never heard the term calamity meat, but I certainly heard of stories of, cattle or farm animals of any kind being taken and a sickly replacement being left, or the cow won't give milk, and it's because it's not really a cow. It's
right.
That sort of thing. I just didn't know there was a term for it. So since we're on the subject of things being taken, there's plenty of stories of people or children being taken, being replaced with changelings. There was a woman whose husband.
Right. I've heard this story. I forget if it was you and I talking about this, but she was selling stuff. She was like, she was sewing stuff and selling things? Or
yes, and she became more successful than her husband.
We might be talking about okay.
Yeah, I think Lore did an episode on this story, because like you were saying, Heidi, it wasn't even that long ago. Like it was in like the 1800s.
Yes.
It wasn't like wasn't like 2000 BC or anything. Granted, I think just real quick to finish that story, basically Guy thinks that his wife is a changeling, murders her, and then cites her being a changeling to try and get out of it. Just want to be real quick at saying that, like, I don't think she was a changeling. I think he murdered his wife, not a good thing. Don't want to diminish that this woman died because she was successful, and how deplorable that is. But in court, they actually talked about it. There was a big debate over, like, well, maybe she was a changeling, and
prove to me she's not, Brendan.
Yeah. It's a Monty Python skit that someone lost their life over. It's awful. But like you're saying, Heidi, the changeling thing is something people really worry about, especially you saw a lot of that kind of, I think, resurgence, around the famine in the mid 1800s. I think, you see, I think you probably saw a resurgence in a lot of that, a lot of this kind of folklore because things were so bad. Yes, go ahead, Nick. Yep.
No, I was just going to say, similar things, stories about changelings and everything, I think you'll find this to be similar, is that a lot of people who are going through, the specific story that I'll bring up comes from the creation of the Oxford English Dictionary. I'm sure a lot of people have read The Professor and the Madman, the creation of the Oxford English Dictionary, which, if there is a singular authoritative text on the Anglophone world, it's the OED. A lot of the early entries were written by an American doctor who had gone through the Civil War, who was imprisoned in Britain in the 19th century for having, I believe he killed a man at a train station. But the bottom line is, he would often talk about his concern that people were coming in while he slept and taking all of his things and replacing them with exact copies and things like that. And there's other similar stories. And so I think this is a near universal, and it makes me wonder if a lot of this belief didn't come from, people are more or less the same now as they were 500, 600, 700 years ago. If these paranoias weren't seen and someone thought, well, there must be something to it, we're seeing it like oftentimes the defense of aliens. Well, when people are being abducted, they're often describing a very similar experience.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Real quick. Yeah. So okay. Two things. One, I'm just gonna say real quick, the parallels between Fae and alien abductions is striking, and there's way more to it than we can get into right now. That being kind of tabled, you're right. There is I think people look for excuses when things go bad. And to be clear, when we say changeling, we don't mean like a lycanthrope or a vampire or a shapeshifter. What the tradition kind of believes is that what would happen is at least in one form, you would have babies that would be swapped out. The Fae would come in, take the healthy human baby and leave a fairy baby. And often whenever kids would get sick, or there'd be major, later on in life, if someone went through a major mood change or suddenly became very sick, it was never anything good. It was always something bad for some reason. People would start to wonder, is this actually a changeling? And there's a lot of really weird stories about it. And it's used as an excuse a lot, I think, or was used a lot to explain, I think a lot of times tragedy. You had sick kids dying a lot, and it was easier to deal with that maybe than the alternative. What do you think, Heidi?
It is much easier to think, my baby is fine. My baby, my sweet, beautiful child is alive and well in the land of the good people. And, the thing that died isn't mine. I'm going to bury it. I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to, say the prayers and do the things, but it's not mine. Mine is still alive, living with the good people. And maybe, just maybe, there's a small chance that they'll escape and come home. I think as, a grief-stricken parent, that's a much better narrative than, holy smokes, my sweet little child that, I carried and went through the very dangerous process of giving birth to went from rosy-cheeked and healthy to gone in, a very short time. So I think it did have a certain appeal also, as kind of weirdly morbid as that is.
Well, but I think you're right. Yeah, that, we use, everybody, like you said, Nick, people are roughly the same as we were 500, 1,000, 5,000 years ago, much more alike than different. I think we can empathize with someone in that situation, and it's not hard to, like you're saying, Heidi, it's not hard to put yourself in that mindset thinking that maybe this is a better alternative. And, I have a hard time holding that against those folks.
Well, let me wrap up today by asking you, Heidi, these stories, what do you feel that they can tell us about today? Or why do you think that people continue to come back to these stories? The Celtic, maybe specifically there's a cultural element, but I'm just kind of interested in your thoughts on that. Why do we return to folklore? What can it tell us about our lives today? Or what solace can we take from it today?
Oh my God, what a loaded question.
I'm asking you to say something very profound with no...
Right. Oh, geez. I don't know. I can't speak for the populace at large. I can speak for myself that I love, I have a love of history, and this folklore is the history of the common man. This isn't the deeds of kings and queens. These aren't great battles. These are farmers. These are merchants. These are your neighbors. So there's this inherent connection to the history of the everyday person. And I think there's also a little bit of comfort in it. There is something familiar in a lot of these stories. There is something that kind of reminds us of when we were growing up, or little things that we saw our grandparents do. And I think that comfort is what draws people back to a lot of these stories, a lot of these myths and legends.
So not a banquet, but a Sunday dinner.
Right. Exactly. It's not very profound, but it's my opinion.
I disagree. I think it's good.